They called it a riding accident. That is what the dispatches said, what the letter from Dr. Fox said, what my Aunt Marjorie told the village and the county and anyone who came to call in those first bewildered weeks of the autumn before last. A riding accident, as though the word accident covered it cleanly. The horse, the low branch, the particular angle of light in the late October afternoon, the way I had turned my head at the wrong moment, and the world had rearranged itself permanently on my right side. As though it were a thing that happened and then was over. It was not over. That is the first thing I will tell you, looking back on it now, because if you do not understand that, you will not understand anything that came after. Not the winter, not the woman, not what I became in that house in the cold months, or what she made of me without ever once trying. My name is Edmund Ashmore. I am the Duke of Caldermere, which means, among other things, that I hold 4,000 acres in a county I will not name and a title that has been in my family for 200 years, and that when I withdrew from society in the November of my 37th year, the county noticed, and the county talked, and the county eventually decided that the Duke of Caldermere had become strange. Dangerous, some said. Brooding. Not right. I did not care what they said. I want you to know that plainly, because later you may be tempted to think that what changed me was the desire to recover my reputation, or the wish to be liked again, or some conventional need to return to the world that had known me before. None of those things moved me. What moved me was a woman who came to my aunt's dower house in the first week of November, 2 years after the accident, and who looked at me, on the day we first met, in the corridor outside Marjorie's sitting room, and simply did not flinch. That is all. It sounds like nothing. You must understand what it meant. I should tell you about the accident properly, because I have spent 2 years not telling it properly to anyone, and because Isolde, Miss Wren, as I called her then, is the one who eventually extracted it from me, in pieces, over the long weeks of that winter, and I think the telling of it here is the best way I can honor what she did. I was on horseback in the eastern woods of Ashmore Park on the 21st of October, 2 years before the winter I am describing. It was late afternoon. The light was horizontal and gold and very particular, the kind of October light that makes everything look briefly like a painting of itself, and I was riding alone because I preferred to ride alone, and I had been riding that stretch of the park for 20 years without incident. The branch was low. I knew it was there. I had ducked beneath it 100 times. I do not know precisely what distracted me. I have turned it over so many times that the memory has worn smooth, like a stone in a river. But I turned my head to the right at the wrong moment, and the branch caught me along the right side of my face, and the horse startled, and I came down. I did not lose consciousness. I wish in some ways that I had. Instead, I lay on the cold ground of the eastern woods and was aware, with a clarity that has never left me, that something had changed permanently. The right eye would not focus. There was pain, and there was blood, and there was the horse standing a few yards away looking at me with what I can only describe as embarrassment, and there was the sound of the park in late October, a wood pigeon somewhere, calling without urgency. Dr. Fox came. My steward came. There was a period of days I do not remember clearly, and then a period of weeks I remember too clearly. The right eye was saved in the sense that it remained in my head and was not removed, but the sight in it was altered permanently, reduced to shapes and light and shadow, useful for nothing precise. I could see with my left eye. I could manage. I could read if the light was good and I did not try for too long. I could ride again, eventually, though I did not for a long time. What I could not manage was the way people looked at me. This is the thing I have never said aloud to anyone who was not Isolde Wren, so I will say it here because she taught me that saying true things plainly is not weakness. The injury itself I could have borne. I had borne worse in earlier years, a broken collarbone at 20, a fever at 30 that had taken 2 weeks, and the better part of my remaining faith in my own constitution. The body's damage I could accommodate. What I could not accommodate was the change in people's faces when they looked at me. Not the scar. The scar along the right side of my face, the branch had opened the skin in a line from my temple to my jaw, was, according to those few who were honest enough to comment, not as bad as I feared. Marjorie said it gave me character, which was Marjorie's way of saying it was noticeable but not disfiguring. Fawkes said I had been lucky, which was Fawkes's way of saying it could have been worse, and was also true. But the way people looked at me changed, and the way people spoke to me changed. And that, not the scar, not the reduced sight, not the long weeks of pain, was what drove me into the particular coldness that the county had decided to call dangerous. They looked at me with pity, or, worse, with the particular wariness that pity becomes when it is mixed with discomfort, the way you look at a man who has had something taken from him that you would not like taken from you. They lowered their voices slightly when they spoke to me, as though the accident had affected my hearing. They were careful. They were considerate. They were so extraordinarily, exhaustingly careful and considerate that I spent the first 6 months after the accident becoming slowly furious, and the second 6 months becoming cold. Coldness was better than fury. Fury was visible. Coldness was manageable. I withdrew from the county assemblies, from the seasonal visits, from the obligations of a duke in his county that I had always discharged without pleasure but with regularity. I let it be known, through my steward, through Marjorie, through the accumulated weight of absence, that Ashmore Park was not receiving. The county adjusted. People found, as people do, a story to hang on the facts. The Duke of Caldermere had been damaged by the accident and had become strange, brooding, not right. I let them have the story. It kept them away. Marjorie did not stay away. Marjorie was my father's sister and was 73 years old and had opinions about everything, and expressed them with a regularity and a force that I had found irritating for 30 years, and that I had come, in the long quiet months of my withdrawal, to find unexpectedly sustaining. She came to the park twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays, from the Dower House a quarter-mile down the estate road, and she sat in my library and told me what I was doing wrong, and then told me about the county, in exhaustive detail, and then went home. I never asked her to come. She never asked permission. We had always understood each other on those terms. It was Marjorie who told me, in the first week of October, that she was expecting a companion. "Her name is Wren," she said. She was sitting in the large armchair to the left of the fire, which was her armchair by occupation if not by right. "Isolde Wren. Her father is a clergyman in Derbyshire. She has been a companion before to Lady Petworth's mother, I'm told, for 3 years, and Lady Petworth speaks well of her." "I am delighted for you," I said. I was reading, which Marjorie never considered a sufficient excuse to ignore her. "She arrives on the 4th of November. I shall try to contain my anticipation." Marjorie looked at me over her spectacles with the particular expression that meant she had noticed my tone and was choosing, this time, to leave it alone. "She is 26, she said, "a clergyman's youngest daughter, no fortune and no connections to speak of. She has been managing on her own since her father's health declined 2 years ago." "Marjorie, I am not matchmaking, Edmund. I am informing you that a young woman of no consequence whatsoever will be living in the Dower House for the foreseeable future. She will occasionally cross your path, as the Dower House is on your estate. I thought it civil to mention it." "Civil," I said. "Entirely civil." I went back to my book. Marjorie drank her tea. The fire said what it always said in October, which was that winter was coming and there was nothing to be done about it. I thought no more about Miss Wren until she arrived. The 4th of November was a Tuesday, which meant Marjorie came to the park in the afternoon as usual, and she brought Miss Wren with her. I did not know she was going to do this. In retrospect, I should have known Marjorie's idea of informing me was to tell me the fact, and then arrange the circumstance at her own convenience, but I was unprepared. I was in the corridor outside Marjorie's sitting room, which is a room I had given over to Marjorie's use years ago for her Tuesday and Friday visits, because she had definite feelings about the quality of the fire in the east wing and strong preferences about the angle of the afternoon light, and I had come down the corridor to tell her that Fawkes had left a note that would require her attention. I had the note in my hand. The corridor was dim. They came through the front door together. I heard it open, heard Marjorie's voice, heard the sound of a second pair of feet, and I stopped at the end of the corridor and waited, because I had learned in 2 years of withdrawal that it was easier to wait than to be come upon suddenly by strangers. Marjorie entered the corridor first, shaking the November cold from her shawl. Behind her came Miss Wren. She was not what I had imagined, though I had not imagined much. She was slight and had dark hair put up very simply, without the elaborate arrangements that were fashionable that season. She wore a gray pelisse that had been good once and was now at the end of its useful life, and she carried a small bag with the air of someone who had carried her own things for some time and had made a practical peace with it. She was not beautiful in any way that the county would have counted. She had a narrow, precise face, watchful dark eyes, a mouth that seemed in repose to be slightly amused by something it had not yet decided to share. She saw me at the end of the corridor, and she stopped, not the sudden stop of alarm, but the clean stop of a person who has assessed a situation and decided how to proceed. Then she looked at me, directly, fully, without the sliding away that I had become accustomed to in the past 2 years. The right side of my face with the scar was toward her. The eye that saw only shapes and light was toward her. She looked at me the way she might have looked at the corridor itself, thoroughly, without particular feeling. "Miss Wren," said Marjorie, "this is my nephew, the Duke of Caldermere. Edmund, this is Miss Isolde Wren, my new companion." "Miss Wren," I said. "Your Grace," she said. She dropped a brief, correct curtsy. "I hope we are not in your way." "You are not," I said. "Good," she said, and turned to take the bag from Marjorie, who had been about to struggle with it. That was all. The encounter lasted perhaps 45 seconds. Marjorie and Miss Wren went into the sitting room, and I stood in the corridor for a moment longer, the note still in my hand, aware that something had just happened that I could not quite name. She had not flinched. She had not lowered her voice. She had not looked at me with the particular quality of careful kindness that I had come to dread. She had looked at me and said what she had to say and turned to do the practical thing. I went back to the library and sat with the fire for a long time and did not read. I did not seek her out in the days that followed. I want to be precise about this because I know how these things are often told. The Duke softened, the Duke pursued. The interest was all on one side, and that is not what happened. In the weeks after her arrival, I did not seek her out. I went about the business of the estate, which was considerable, and I managed my steward and my correspondence and my 2 Tuesday and Friday visits from Marjorie. And I kept, as I had kept for 2 years, to the regular patterns of a man who has decided that regularity is the only available substitute for happiness. But the estate is not large, in the sense that a man cannot live on it for years without encountering another person who also lives on it, and the dower house is a 1/4 mile down the estate road, and Marjorie and Miss Wren walked on the estate road most mornings when the weather permitted. I encountered her for the second time on a Wednesday in the second week of November. I had been to the home farm to look at a drainage problem with my steward. There was a field at the north end of the estate that was flooding badly that autumn, and I was walking back along the estate road in the gray mid-morning light when I saw her coming toward me. She was alone. She was wearing the gray pelisse again and a pair of boots that were sensible rather than elegant, and she was reading a letter, actually reading, walking and reading simultaneously, with the letter held up in front of her in the manner of someone who does not have time to wait until she is standing still. When she heard my footsteps, she looked up, folded the letter with 2 quick, efficient folds, and put it in her pocket. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Wren," I said, Good morning. Good morning. She paused, which I had not expected. How is the North Field? Your steward mentioned the flooding yesterday. Marjorie is concerned about the estate road. She says it was bad last winter and she had to use the longer way round for 6 weeks. I stopped walking. The North Field is going to require a new drainage channel before the ground freezes, I said. Marjorie knows about the flooding. Marjorie knows about everything on this estate, said Miss Wren, with a slight dryness that I found unexpectedly precise. She has been living on it for 40 years. I think she may know more than your steward. That is entirely possible, I said. Miss Wren considered this, seemed satisfied, and wished me a good morning and continued down the road. I stood and watched her go for a moment, the sensible boots, the straight back, the quick pace of someone with somewhere to be, and then continued toward the house. She had not asked how I was. She had not made the face. She had spoken to me about the North Field with the same tone she would have used to speak about the North Field to anyone, and then she had gone. I found that I was, for the first time in some weeks, moderately interested in the rest of the day. November moved through the estate with its customary gray authority. The drainage channel was dug before the first hard frost. The North Field recovered. I wrote 6 letters I had been putting off writing and spent 2 days in my steward's company going over the estate accounts, which were in better shape than I had feared but not as good as they should have been. Marjorie came on Tuesdays and Fridays. Sometimes she brought Miss Wren, sometimes she did not. When she did not, I noticed the absence without intending to. This is the part I find difficult to explain, not because it was complicated but because it was so quiet. It was not a sudden thing. I did not meet her once and understand what was happening. I met her, over the course of November, perhaps a dozen times, on the estate road, in Marjorie's sitting room when I came to speak to my aunt and Miss Wren was there, once in the estate chapel when I went to leave a letter for the curate, and found her sitting alone in the 3rd pew with a book. I had not known she was there. I nearly turned and left. She looked up and said, without particular expression, "Don't let me drive you away. I'm only reading because the dower house is cold this morning." "It shouldn't be cold," I said. I was annoyed, in the way I was annoyed by all practical failures on the estate. "I'll speak to." "The problem is the east chimney," she said. "Your steward is aware. I believe the sweep is coming on Thursday." I stood in the doorway of the chapel for a moment, uncertain. She had already looked back at her book. I came in and sat in the pew nearest the door and looked at the plain stone of the chapel wall and at the November light through the clear windows, and after a while she said, without looking up, "What was this chapel used for before the present family? It's older than the house, isn't it?" 15th century, I said. The estate was a religious house for a period. The chapel predates everything else by 200 years. She considered this. "That explains the floor. The stone flags. They're not aligned with the windows. I couldn't understand it, but if they came before the windows, it makes sense." I looked at the flags. I had walked on them for 30 years without considering their alignment. "You're right," I said. She said nothing further. We sat in the chapel for perhaps another 20 minutes, she reading, I looking at the floor and the windows and the November light. And then she said she had to return before Marjorie wondered where she was, and she went. I sat in the chapel alone for some time after. I will tell you what I was beginning to understand, slowly, in the gray weeks of that November. It was not the obvious thing, not the surface thing, not the thing that people say about a man who begins to notice a woman. It was simpler and more precise than that. I was beginning to understand that I had spent 2 years in a particular kind of loneliness that had nothing to do with being alone. I had been surrounded in those 2 years by people who were careful with me, who measured their words, who did not quite know where to look. And I had become, in response, a man who made it easier for everyone by being cold and requiring nothing. Miss Wren was not careful with me in that way. She was not careless. She was precise, attentive, and entirely practical, but her precision was not directed at managing me. She spoke to me as though I were a person of ordinary consequence in an ordinary situation, and what she said was exactly what she thought, and she did not adjust it for my benefit. I had not known until she arrived how profoundly I had missed that. December came, and with it the first real snow of the season. Ashmore Park in December is a particular thing. The ground's close in, the lake freezes in the cold years, the estate road becomes passable only in the mornings before the afternoon frost sets. The house is large enough to lose days in if you let it. I had spent the previous December largely losing days in it, managing the estate correspondence and reading and speaking to no one except Marjorie and my steward, and on one memorably bad afternoon, the parish curate, who had called to ask if I would attend the Christmas service, and who had been so uncomfortable in my presence that I had concluded the visit in 12 minutes for both our sakes. This December was different, and I will try to explain how. Marjorie, in the third week of November, had announced with perfect casualness that Miss Wren was skilled at the pianoforte, and had offered to play for us on Friday evenings if I had no objection. I had said I had no objection. This was true, though it was also somewhat beside the point, since Marjorie had already arranged the evenings in the manner of someone who considers an absence of refusal to be equivalent to consent. The first Friday evening was the 4th of December. Marjorie's sitting room has a pianoforte that had belonged to my mother, and that had been largely untouched since my mother's death. Miss Wren sat down at it with the manner of someone who is comfortable with a thing and does not need to announce the fact. She played for perhaps 40 minutes pieces I did not recognize, not the fashionable things of the season but older music, quiet and precise, the kind that does not demand your attention so much as simply fill the room. Marjorie did her needlework. I sat near the fire and listened. Afterward, when Miss Wren had finished and was replacing the sheet music, Marjorie said, "Play the one you were practicing this morning." And Miss Wren said, "I was only working through it. It's not ready." And Marjorie said, "Play it anyway," with the authority of a woman who has spent 73 years getting her way, and Miss Wren played it anyway. It was not ready. It had a passage in the middle where she paused briefly and began again. But it was also, in the pauses and the beginning again, more interesting than anything I had heard in 2 years. There was a quality to it that I could not name for some time. Something in the way she played through the difficulty without apology and without drama, simply stopping and starting again, as though the difficulty were a fact to be addressed rather than a performance to be managed. When she finished, Marjorie said, "Better." "The left hand is still wrong in the middle passage," Miss Wren said. "Yes," said Marjorie, "but better." I said nothing. I was not sure what I would have said. On the walk back to the Dower house, I walked them to the door as the estate road was icy. Miss Wren said without preamble, "Do you play?" "No," I said. "Did you?" "A little as a boy." "Nothing worth calling playing." "Your mother's pianoforte has been very well maintained for something that isn't used," she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, delivered in the tone of someone who notices things and comments on them without particular judgment. "My housekeeper maintains it," I said. "I asked her to." Miss Wren considered this for a moment, walking beside me on the icy road with the careful balance of someone who has learned from experience. "That's kind," she said. "It seemed a waste to let it go," I said. She did not say anything further. We reached the Dower house, and I held the lantern while she found the key, and she went in and I walked back up the road through the December dark. "Kind." She had said it without the particular softness that made the word feel like something else, something closer to pity than to its actual meaning. She had said it the way she said everything, plainly and exactly. I went back to the library and sat with the lamp for a long time. I will not pretend that I understood what was happening to me in December in the way I understand it now, looking back. At the time I understood it only as a gradual and not entirely welcome change in the quality of the days. The days were better. The mornings were still mornings, with all the gray particular difficulty that mornings in December carry, but something in them was different, something that had to do with the knowledge that there was, on the estate, a person who would speak to me plainly if we encountered each other. We encountered each other regularly through December. Marjorie's Tuesdays and Fridays, the Friday evening music, the occasional crossing of paths on the estate road or in the chapel, which Miss Wren had taken to visiting 2 or 3 mornings a week. I asked her once why she liked the chapel, and she said, "Because it is old and cold and honest. The dower house is warm, but it requires conversation. The chapel requires nothing." I understood this. "The library is similar," I said. She turned this over briefly. "You don't mind being there alone?" "I prefer it," I said. And then, because this seemed to require some explanation, and I found with her that I wanted to give honest answers, or I did for a long time, I am less certain now that I prefer everything alone. She looked at me, not the long look of someone who has heard something significant and is deciding what to do with it, just a look, clear and brief. "That's not a small thing," she said, "to become less certain." "No," I said. We were in the chapel, and the December light through the clear windows was thin and pale, and there was frost on the inside of the glass in the upper corners, and it was the most honest conversation I had had with anyone in 2 years. Christmas came and went with the quiet of a household that has no particular reason to celebrate. Marjorie insisted on a small gathering at the dower house, herself, Miss Wren, the curate's wife, and by Marjorie's arrangement and my reluctant attendance myself. I had not sat at a social table since the accident. I had managed in 2 years to avoid exactly this situation by the simple expedient of not being invited, or by declining when I was. I had not declined this invitation because it had not been framed as an invitation. It had been framed as information. "We are having supper at the dower house on Christmas Eve. I am telling you this so that you have time to arrange to attend," which was so perfectly Marjorie that I had found it difficult to argue with. The curate's wife was a good woman who was so nervous in my presence that she spoke without stopping for the first quarter of an hour, which meant I had to do very little. The curate himself addressed most of his remarks to the tablecloth. Marjorie directed the conversation with the efficiency of a general, and did not allow any awkwardness to settle long enough to become significant. And Miss Wren sat across from me and spoke when she had something to say, and was quiet when she did not, and refilled Marjorie's wine without being asked, and twice deflected the curate's wife into a more comfortable topic when she felt the conversation beginning to strain. I watched her do it the second time and thought, she does this without appearing to do it. After supper, the curate and his wife took their leave early, the curate's wife, I suspected, out of relief, and Marjorie announced that she was tired and that Edmund would walk Miss Wren home and that she would see us both on Friday. This was said with the same casualness as all Marjorie's arrangements, which is to say with the absolute authority of someone who does not leave space for argument. Miss Wren and I walked out into the Christmas Eve cold. It had snowed that afternoon, and the snow had hardened into a clean, dense whiteness on the estate road, and the sky was very clear, with more stars than I had seen in months. "She does that deliberately," said Miss Wren after a moment. "Marjorie, always," I said. "Does it bother you?" I thought about it honestly. "Less than it should," I said. She was quiet for a few steps. The cold was very still. "She loves you very much," she said. It was not a sentimental observation. It was just the fact stated plainly. "Yes," I said, "and I her. We simply have an understanding about what love is allowed to look like between us." "Which is?" "Practical," I said. "Reliable, not excessive." She considered this. "My father was similar," she said. "He was not a demonstrative man, but he came to every performance I ever gave on the pianoforte, from the time I was 8 years old, through all the years I played in the village hall and the drawing rooms of people who were kind enough to tolerate an amateur. He never said much about it afterward. He would just come and sit in the same chair and listen. And that was enough, I said. More than enough, she said. It was everything. We had reached the dower house. I held up the lantern while she found her key, the same gesture as 3 weeks earlier in December, and I thought about her father coming to sit in the same chair and listen. "Miss Wren," I said. She had the door open. She turned. "Merry Christmas," I said. She smiled. It was not the performance of a smile, not the managed brightness I had grown accustomed to in social situations. It was a small, real, warm thing. "Merry Christmas, Your Grace," she said, and went in. I walked back to the house through the Christmas Eve cold, with the stars overhead and the frozen lake visible through the trees, and I understood, with the particular clarity that cold air and the absence of other people sometimes produce, that I was in serious trouble. January. The new year came in with 2 days of heavy snow that made the estate road nearly impassable and reduced the world of Ashmore Park to a contained, white, very still thing. I spent the first 3 days of January going over the estate accounts with renewed attention and writing letters that I had been delaying, and on the 4th day I walked to the home farm through the snow to check on the drainage channel, which had survived the freeze in better shape than I had feared. On the way back I passed the lake. The lake at Ashmore Park is not large, perhaps an acre, surrounded by old beeches that are striking in summer and magnificent in winter, when the branches are bare and very precise against a white sky. It had frozen hard in December and had been solid through the Christmas week. I had not walked to the lake in 2 years. Before the accident, I had been in the habit of walking there in the winter mornings, because there is a particular quality of light on ice that I have always found clarifying. I stopped at the edge of the bank and looked at the frozen surface and the bare beaches and the white sky, and after a moment I heard footsteps in the snow behind me. Miss Wren. She was wearing a dark coat I had not seen before, heavier than the gray police, probably borrowed or recently acquired, and she had her hands in a muff, and she was walking toward the lake from the direction of the dower house path. She saw me and stopped. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know anyone came here. I'll find another way round." "You don't need to," I said. "I was only looking." She came and stood a few feet away and looked at the lake. The ice was very white in the January light, with a slight texture across the surface from where the snow had blown before it froze. "I used to come here in the mornings," I said, and did not know why I said it. "Before the accident," she said, "it was not a question." She had, I realized, a reliable sense of when something was from before. "Yes." "Why did you stop?" The question was direct. She asked it the way she asked everything, without the particular softness that would have made it easier, which would also have made it more avoidable. I looked at the ice and considered giving a partial answer and decided against it. "Because coming here required walking across the east lawn," I said, "and the east lawn is visible from the lane, and in the first months after the accident I did not want to be visible." She was quiet for a moment, and now I've been invisible for 2 years, I said, and I find it has its own difficulty. She considered this, with the same attentiveness she gave to everything. "The county thinks you've become strange," she said. "Marjorie told me what they say." "I know what they say." "It's not what I think," she said. "It was plainly stated, not offered as comfort." I looked at her. "What do you think?" She looked at the lake and then back at me, and her eyes were direct and very clear. "I think you were in pain," she said, "and you did what people do in pain when they are proud and have the means to do it. You removed yourself from the situation that was causing the pain, which was other people looking at you with pity. And then the removal became a habit, and then it became a reputation, and now you are managing the reputation as well as the original pain, which seems like unnecessary additional work. I stared at her. That is, she said with the faintest dryness, entirely my own assessment, and you are of course free to disagree with it. I don't disagree with it, I said. She looked faintly surprised. I have not, I said, been in the habit of finding people who say true things plainly. The experience is somewhat startling. I'm told it can be, she said. We stood at the edge of the lake for a while longer in the January cold, and she said, "Does the right eye see the lake?" "Shapes," I said, "light and shadow. The ice is white and the trees are dark and the sky is lighter still. It's not nothing." "No," she said, looking at the ice, "it's not nothing." I want to be careful how I tell this next part, because it is the part that matters most, and it is the easiest to tell wrong. There was nothing sudden about it after the lake. There was no single afternoon that changed everything, no dramatic declaration, no scene that announced itself as the scene. It was the continuation of what had been happening since November, the Friday evenings, the estate road, the chapel, the occasional afternoon, but it was different in the way that January is different from November. The ground harder, the light more honest, less possibility of pretending that the cold will lift soon. I began, in January, to speak to her honestly. This is not as small a thing as it sounds. I had not spoken honestly to anyone outside of Marjorie and Fawkes in 2 years, and I had not spoken honestly about the accident, about the 2 years, about what they had cost me, to anyone. I had spoken about it in the way I speak about most things, in practical terms, in the terms of what needed to be managed, not in the terms of what it had felt like. She asked questions. That was the instrument of it. She asked questions that were not cautious. That did not come with the particular gentleness that means you're asking because you think the person might break, and if they break, you'll be responsible. She asked because she wanted to know, and because she thought I was capable of answering, and the combination of those two things made answering possible. She asked about the day of the accident itself. We were in the library, the second week of January. She had brought a book for Marjorie and had come to return it, and we had somehow been in the library together for an hour before either of us mentioned it. She asked what the light had been like that afternoon, and I told her about the horizontal gold light and the wood pigeon, and she listened without the face, without the soft, pained expression that I had come to dread, and said, "It's strange how much you remember of the physical things." "The physical things are the ones that don't require interpretation," I said. "Yes," she said, and I thought she understood this from experience, which meant she had her own things she remembered in physical terms, and I wanted to ask about them and did not yet. She asked about the months afterward, not invasively, not with the manner of someone extracting something, but in the course of things, as we spoke through January in the library and the estate road, and once, memorably, in the kitchen of the Dower house, when I had come to speak to Marjorie about the estate road repairs and Marjorie had been resting, and Miss Wren had offered tea, and we had drunk it at the kitchen table like two people who had been doing exactly this for years. She asked what the worst of it had been, not meaning the pain. She had already worked that out, but the daily texture of it. I told her about the way people's faces changed, the lowered voices, the careful, exhausting kindness. She listened to this and said, "I imagine that was worse than the injury." "It was," I said. "Because the injury was yours," she said, "but the way they treated you was something being done to you, and you had no way to manage it except to remove yourself." "Yes," I said. It was the most accurately I had ever heard it described. She looked at her tea and said, "My father became ill 2 years ago. Not dramatically, nothing sudden. His mind began to go in the gradual, relentless way that is harder, in some respects, than something sudden, because you can see him in the moments between, and it seems impossible that the moments between could be narrowing. People began to speak to me about him in exactly that tone, very careful, very kind, very intent on my being all right, and I found I could not bear it. Not the fact of his illness, but the particular quality of other people's careful kindness about it. She had not told me about her father before. She had mentioned him once on Christmas Eve, but not the illness. I looked at her across the kitchen table and thought, she has been managing this alone, and she has been managing it in exactly the way I recognize. "I'm sorry," I said. I said it the way she said things, without the excessive softness. It was simply the true thing, stated plainly. She looked up. "Thank you," she said, and it was the first time I had heard her say thank you with any weight behind it. The middle weeks of January. The freeze had settled in. The estate road was clear, but the fields were iron-hard, the lake solid, the days short and bright and very cold. I had begun, in the second week, to find reasons to walk to the dower house rather than sending my steward, which Fawkes noticed and said nothing about, for which I was grateful. On one occasion I arrived, and Miss Wren was reading to Marjorie in the sitting-room, and I stood in the doorway unannounced and listened for 5 minutes before either of them saw me. The book was a history of the Roman province of Britain, and Miss Wren was reading it with the same calm authority with which she did everything, and Marjorie was listening with her eyes half closed in the way that meant she was genuinely attending, not sleeping. When they saw me, Marjorie said, "Come in or go away, Edmund. Don't stand in the doorway." And Miss Wren looked up and said, "We've just reached the settlement of the northern frontier." And I came in and sat down, and Miss Wren continued reading. This is one of the things I want you to understand about those weeks, about what she was to me in that January. She included me in things as though my presence were ordinary, not with the eagerness of someone trying to draw out a recluse, and not with the careful management of someone who thought I needed to be handled. Simply, with the same practical ease she brought to everything. "We are doing this. You may do it with us if you like." I had not been included like that since before the accident. I had not known how much I had been missing it. She finished the chapter and closed the book, and Marjorie said she wanted 15 minutes of quiet before supper, and Miss Wren went to set the fire in the dining room, and I followed her, which was not something I had planned to do. "Can I ask you something?" I said. I was aware that this was the first time I had asked her a direct question about herself that was not connected to a practical matter. She was kneeling at the fire, and she looked back over her shoulder at me. "Yes." "On the afternoon we first met," I said. "In the corridor, you looked at me directly." "Yes," she said. She turned back to the fire. "Most people don't," I said. "Or they look and then look away. Or they look at the left side of my face, the undamaged side, and pretend to be looking at the whole." She was quiet for a moment. She set the kindling in the grate and said, without turning around, "I had been told about the accident before I came. Marjorie mentioned it. She said there had been an injury to your face and your eye, and she said it had been difficult, and she said she was telling me because she did not want me to be surprised and make a fool of myself." That sounds like Marjorie. It does. She struck the flint and caught the kindling. So I knew, and I thought that if I looked at you as though there was something uncomfortable to be negotiated, that would be worse than simply looking at you. "It was," I said. "The negotiation is what I can't bear." She stood up and turned around, and we were standing in the small dining room with the fire just beginning to take behind her, and she looked at me with the direct, clear look that I had come to know over 3 months. "I know," she said. "I could see that the first day. You were waiting for it. You'd been waiting for it so long it had changed the way you stood in the corridor." I did not know what to say to this. I stood in the dining room and looked at her and thought, she has been seeing me clearly since the first afternoon, and I have been slowly understanding over 3 months that this is what was happening. "Miss Wren," I said. "Isolde," she said, "if you are going to ask me something that matters." I understood this. It was a thing she had just decided, on the instant, with the practicality she brought to everything. We have reached the point where formality is dishonest. We should call it by its right name. "Isolde," I said. "Edmund," she said, which was the first time she had used my name, and it landed with a weight I had not anticipated. "I don't know," I said, "how to say what I want to say in a way that I have no practice at this. I withdrew 2 years ago, and one of the things I lost in the withdrawal was the habit of saying what I meant about anything that mattered, because there was no one to say it to." "I know," she said. She was not impatient. She was simply present, waiting with the same quality of attention she gave everything. "What I want to say," I said, "is that this winter, these 3 months, have been different from the 2 years before them in a way that I cannot account for except by your presence on this estate. I want to be careful not to say something that would make things strange between us. I don't know if I can say it without making things strange." "Try," she said. I looked at her. "You looked at me the first day," I said, "and you did not flinch, and you spoke to me as though I were simply a person, and I had forgotten what that felt like. And then you kept doing it every time we spoke. You said what you thought, and you did not manage me, and you did not pity me, and you asked real questions and expected real answers. And I find that I have been coming back to every conversation and thinking about them afterward, and looking for reasons to walk to the dower house when a letter would have done, and I am not precisely certain what to do with any of that." She was quiet for a moment. The fire had caught behind her, and the dining room was warming, and there was frost on the window and the January dark outside. "I have been doing the same," she said finally, coming back to the conversations, looking for the estate road reasons. A pause. "I thought it was probably professional folly, given that you are the Duke whose estate I am living on and whose aunt I am companion to, but I thought it none the less." I looked at her steadily. "Professional folly. It is the category," she said, "that seemed most accurate." "And if," I said, "I were to say that I would prefer it not to be professional folly, that I would prefer to speak to Marjorie about a different arrangement, a permanent one, or as permanent as I don't want to say something that—" "Edmund," she said, with a slight curve at the corner of her mouth, "you are composing 4 sentences at once and finishing none of them." "Yes," I said, "I know. I told you I had lost the habit." She looked at me for a long, clear moment, and then she said, "Ask me what you mean to ask." I asked her. It was not a speech. It was 3 sentences, which seemed to me the honest number, what I wanted and why, and what I was offering. She listened to all 3 without interrupting. Then she was quiet for the length of time it takes a fire to settle into its first real warmth. Then she said yes. It was not the beginning of anything easy. I want to be clear about that because I know how these stories are often told as though the yes is an ending, a resolution, the moment when all the difficult things cease to be difficult. It was not that. My eye did not recover. The scar did not fade. The county continued to think what it thought about the Duke of Caldermere, at least for some time. My habits of withdrawal were not simply exchanged for habits of openness overnight. They took longer, and required, occasionally, her patience in quantities that I was glad she had. But here is what was true, and true from that evening in the January dining room with the fire behind her and the frost on the window. I was no longer managing alone. That is the thing when I try to explain it now. Not that she fixed the wound. Not that she made the 2 years not to have been the 2 years. Not that she was some form of remedy that I had been needing and not finding. It was simpler than that and harder than that. She was present genuinely, practically, honestly present, and her presence made the managing different. Lighter in the sense of less solitary, more possible in the sense of less without point. She spoke to Marjorie the next morning. Marjorie received the information with the expression of a woman who has arranged exactly this result and is graciously pretending that she did not. She said, "Well, it's about time," which was her highest form of approval, and rang for tea. I spoke to Marjorie that afternoon. Marjorie said, "I know, Edmund, I've just been told," and then said, "She is exactly what she appears to be, which is more than can be said for most people." I had not asked for her assessment. She had offered it because she knew it was what I needed to hear, not as a recommendation, but as a confirmation. A woman who is exactly what she appears to be. After 2 years of managing faces and tones and the careful, exhausting distance between what people said and what they meant, this was nearly more than I could absorb. We were married in April at the estate chapel, the old stone chapel that she had been visiting in the mornings all through that winter, with its misaligned flags and its clear windows and its 15th century cold. It was a small wedding. Marjorie, my steward, and his wife, who had worked for me for 20 years and deserved to be there. The curate, who was considerably less nervous than he had been at Christmas, which I attributed to the general improvement in the atmosphere of the park, and possibly to the fact that I had donated substantially to the repair of the chapel roof. Isolde wore a dress that was fine without being fashionable, in the way she did everything, and she looked at me when she said her vows with the same direct, clear look that she had given me in the corridor on the 4th of November, when she had first arrived, and had not flinched. The county adjusted, eventually. There is always a period of adjustment when a duke marries a clergyman's daughter of no fortune and no connections, and we allowed the period its due time, and paid it no particular attention. Marjorie helped, in the manner of a woman who has long experience of directing county opinion without appearing to do so. Fawkes helped, in the manner of a man who mentions things to the right people at the right moment and then says nothing more. And Isolde herself helped, in the only way she knew how, by being exactly what she was every time without adjustment or performance. By speaking plainly and listening carefully and noticing the things that mattered, the alignment of the chapel floor, the condition of the north field, the quality of the afternoon light on the lake in November. By asking real questions and expecting real answers and not flinching from either. The county came round, eventually, to a version of the truth, that the Duke of Caldermere had married a woman of no particular consequence, and that the Duke of Caldermere was, since that winter, a different man. Not healed precisely, not restored to the man before the accident, as though the accident were something to be erased. A different man. The kind that comes from 2 years of cold, and then a winter with a woman who looked at him plainly and spoke to him plainly, and said yes, in a January dining room with the fire behind her and the frost on the window. There are winters still that are harder than others. There are days when the right eye is more present to me, its limitation, its reminder, than I would choose. There are occasions still when someone looks at me with that particular quality of careful pity, and I feel the old cold settling in me like weather. On those days, Isolde will sometimes look at me across whatever room we are in, not to signal anything, not to perform reassurance, just the same direct, clear look she has always given me, from the first corridor to now. The look that sees nothing to pity. The look that sees only the man. That is the whole of it. That is what she gave me, and what I have tried to give back to her in every way I know. Someone present and honest and capable of saying real things plainly. Someone who comes to every performance and sits in the same chair and says nothing afterward except, in the silence of having been there, everything. The winter stars, I've read, are the ones that shine brightest in the darkest season, not because they are larger or warmer than the rest, but simply because the nights are longer and the sky is clearer, and if you are willing to stand in the cold and look up, they are there. She was always there. I simply finally looked up.